Good morning to everyone.
Oh, that's so nice.
Welcome to Defending Your Faith in a Post-Truth Culture. Before we begin, I'll pray for us and for this session. Our Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather as a family and learn of and from you. May this program aid in the work you've already begun in our hearts and minds, drawing us into closer relationship with you. We thank you for your presence in our midst, and we ask your wise leadership over all that is said and done here this morning, to your glory and the furtherance of your kingdom. Amen. If you don't already or haven't already discovered the handout to the back of the room, this would probably be a good time to grab one of the handouts. And next to it is another piece of paper. It's a survey. And immediately after the presentation, if you can fill it out and put it in this blue box up here, I would greatly appreciate that. Just a little bit about me. I've met most of you already, but for those of you whom I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Charlene Friedman. I'm a wife, a mother, and a grandmother of one. Academically, academically, I earned a BA and an MA in psychology and pastoral counseling, Master of Divinity, Master of Apologetics, and my doctoral work is in leadership and discipleship or spiritual formation. It is important that I say right now that I am not a scholar by any stretch of the imagination. I'm called to the pastoral ministry. God has given me 3 spiritual gifts, primary spiritual gifts, and apparently equal passion for all 3. Evangelism, pastoral care, and preaching and teaching. I put that last one together, preaching and teaching. While I am not a scholar, I have learned a few things from some scholarly people and from the great spiritual and intellectual giants of the church. I've learned a great deal. And my hope this morning is that as I share what I've learned, it will help you develop a deeper relationship with the Lord, address any doubts you may have, and help to prepare you to answer questions about Christianity and the Christian worldview. The program outline for this morning, I'm going to courageously attempt to do 5 things. I'll answer what is apologetics, why study apologetics. I'm going to present an objection to a major evangelism tool, and I'll tell you what that tool is shortly. I'm going to respond to the Jesus myth theory, and then make the case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All of this information, you can follow me as best you can in the handout. I've put some lines there too, that you can fill in any questions or comments that you'd like to make as I go toward the end of the program, but you do that as I go along. There's a card in front of you, a little maybe 4x2 card. I'd like you to think of 1 or 2 objections to Christianity from family members, friends, neighbors, strangers that you've heard. And if as you write, think about your own doubts that you may have, and write one or two of those as well. If your doubts are, for the most part, settled on Christianity, then write the doubts that you've heard from others, objections. I'd like to look at those and point out as I go along in the program beginning next week how we might have addressed those today, and as I go along I'm going to point to this is the way we can handle this particular doubt or questions and so on. I am likely not going to get to every question, but I'm going to put my email on the board and you feel free to reach out to me, and if I don't know the answer, I know people who do, and I'll be able to respond that way too. You should also know that there aren't an infinite number of objections to Christianity. There just isn't. There are a few broad categories, and little questions fit into these broad categories. So I may be able to touch on most of the objections you might write on the card as we go along today and the next 3 weeks. The first thing on my agenda is, what is apologetics? I'm going to answer that by addressing 3 things: the meaning of apologetics, the work of apologetics, and the goal of apologetics. All of that is in your handout as well. Apologetics means to defend. The term comes from the Greek word apologia, which means defense, like a lawyer would defend in a court of law. In classical Greek period, and possibly a little earlier, the term meant in defense of, and usually in defense of oneself. You needed to go to court and defend yourself and keep yourself out of jail. So Christian apologetics then means in defense of the Christian faith. The work of apologetics. The work of apologetics is to defend Christian beliefs, correct false ideas and speculations raised up against the knowledge of God. Apologetics helps to explain and clarify the gospel message and helps us develop intellectual, reasonable explanation of the Christian message and worldview. And the goal of apologetics, I say this is twofold. First, it's to strengthen our faith, help us to sort out any doubts we might have, and then deepen our knowledge of and love for God. And the second part of the goal of apologetics is to attract non-believers to Christ by way of the gospel. Back in 2013, I was involved in an apologetics ministry that had an awesome title. It said, "Helping the believer think and the thinker believe."
Great.
I think that's a fitting description.
Say that again.
Helping the thinker believe, no, helping the believer, helping us to think, and then thinkers out there, helping them to believe. So helping the believer think and the thinker believe. It is a fitting description of the goal of apologetics. So number 2 on my item on my agenda this morning is why study apologetics. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus explicitly and implicitly exhorts us to share the good news of the gospel about him. Here are 2 explicit texts, and you'll find it in your handout: Matthew 28:16-20 and Mark 16:15. Can someone please read Mark 16:15? It's printed there, probably on page 2 or so of your handout.
He said to them, "Go into all the world
and preach the gospel to all creation.
This is the essence of evangelism. It's what Jesus commands all of us to do. This is not just the work of the missionary in a far, far land or the pastor in the pulpit. This is the work we are called to do. So it begs the question, do we need apologetics to share the gospel about Jesus Christ? What do you think?
Yes.
It depends who you want to share it with.
Good,
If
good.
you're sharing with another believer, that's one thing. If you're sharing it with somebody who's outside the faith, then of course you need that.
Yeah, so it's a yes or no answer, right?
I would say with the active non-believer, you need apologetics. Active non-believer.
Yes,
They're promoting their belief in non-belief.
yes.
But with a everyday church is a stranger to them, you don't need apologetics, you need invitation.
Yes,
You need to speak up and invite them to church.
yes. So I hear Andy say, and others, that there are people we will encounter who will respond positively to the gospel without apologetics. I came to Christ without even knowing what this term meant as a youngster. And I'm sure many of you came to Christ without apologetics. Is that true?
Yes.
But there are those that Andy's talking about and you're talking about. They'll need us to go deeper, explain what we're talking about and why they should come to church. Some people need an explanation for everything. Especially in today's culture. And I think it is especially this latter group, the Apostle Peter exhorts us to prepare, to give a reason for what we say we believe. Can someone read 1 Peter 3:15 for me? It's also in the handout, probably about the same page or page 3.
But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect.
Yes. We must revere Christ, worship him. This is talking about personal religiosity. This is what we believe. This is what we accept. But we must prepare to share the gospel. This is the public aspect of Christianity. Christianity is very different in this regard from other religions. It's not just about keeping your religion to yourself privately at home in your closet. We are called by Jesus himself to take this belief that you have and share it with others. So this is the essence of the text. Peter is telling us that faith and reason work together. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical to his bishops, called Fides et Ratio, Latin for faith and reason, summarizes this well. He writes, truth is known through a combination of faith and reason. The absence of either one will diminish man's ability to know himself, know the world, and know God. He goes on to say, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. I believe apologetics is the reason component of this faith-reason equation that John Paul II speaks of. But this is not unique to us. This has been the responsibility of every Christian at every time. The early Christians, even medieval Christians, and then in Martin Luther in the 16th century, they battled heresies and they refuted them. Gnosticism comes to mind. This was a plague in the early church from the 1st century all the way up to the 3rd century until it was finally squashed. But there's a resurgence of it in some sects of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. But this has always been the work of Christians throughout the century, and we are not exempt from doing this work. But sadly, fewer and fewer Christians are sharing the gospel with others. So says the major research groups, Barna and Pew and others. So I'll ask you, why is that? Why are fewer and fewer of us sharing the gospel?
I think I shared with you several weeks ago that I honestly believe that a huge swath of those that are in the pew on a Sunday morning have real doubts, actually, about the validity of the faith, given the post-truth world. And so they don't want to embarrass themselves by sharing it and appear foolish.
Yes.
Thus, how valuable this course is. Thank you.
Yes.
I think it comes back to how we're catechizing our youth.
Yeah.
I mean, now, I grew up Lutheran, though some of you have heard me say this. My confirmation class was every Saturday morning in 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. In this church, it's, what, a Tuesday afternoon for an hour for 10 or 12 weeks? I think, and when you look at the fallout from church attendance and faith in of the people who have gone through our confirmation class, I think we would be embarrassed if we learned that.
Yes.
So I don't think we actually know it. We don't want to know. But I think, it always reminds me of the Willow Creek Church. After being in existence for 12 or 15 years, they did a survey, and they found that the belief system, the belief of the people in that congregation was an inch deep and a mile wide. And fortunately, they changed their approach to catechesis of the entire congregation, because they realized that what they had been doing wasn't getting the job done. So I think one of the things that the churches have to do is pay attention to the catechesis of our youth, so that it does get the job done. So that when they get to college and are faced with a great professor who seems reasonable in every other way, who says, all the really smart people in the world are atheists.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's the thing we need to work on.
One other thing, I believe most Christians join a Christian club. That is the church. And they are so pleased to be in the club that they enjoy Sunday mornings, but they don't have any evangelism training, so they keep to themselves as members of the club, and they don't share their faith with anybody.
Yes. Go on.
In some parts of the world, and increasingly even in this country, it has become socially dangerous and even legally dangerous to recite certain parts of the Bible. Romans 1:26 in particular. If you were to be, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. If you were to read that in a public space in Scotland today, would you risk imprisonment? You might. There was a member of the Danish Parliament who was brought up on charges, I think, for citing that exact verse or something very like it.
Yeah.
She was acquitted, but
It's dangerous business.
It's a dangerous, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing I appreciate about Barnabas, and it's not true in every Presbyterian church, in fact, I don't think it's true in most churches, Presbyterian, is the fact that he either gives the gospel directly or he speaks in such a way that you want to know more about it. And this is unusual in a Presbyterian ministry.
That's good. I have a personal belief where every youth pastor should be trained, formally trained in apologetics. We send our children as Christians off to college, someone just mentioned this and the professor, and they leave agnostic or atheist. It is very, very true.
But it's
Very true.
bigger than that, because when our children are young, Sunday is the day for the soccer team or the baseball
Yeah,
team. And
right.
the time you can get time on the ice rink so that you can become an ice skater. And over time, when we were kids, that wasn't so.
Yes.
Things were closed on Sunday, you were at home on Sunday,
Yes.
you were, you weren't out playing sports or doing other things. And they may be very good things for your physical self or your future life, your career.
Yes.
But over time, we have let the secular world take over where the church once was strong.
Yes. And parents back then taught their children about Christ and theology. Parents are too busy to do that today, and we think it's the most important thing we can share with our children. And we've relegated that to the Sunday school, and Sunday school is great, but it does not exempt parents from still doing that work of teaching their children and grandchildren theology. So I suspect, to add to all that we're saying, there's an aspect of sharing the gospel that is hard. It's challenging because we do not feel equipped to handle objections that people may raise. If I share the gospel with this one or that one, what if they ask me this or that and I don't know how to respond? And that's reasonable. Like military soldiers, they do not just find themselves in a military theater or war theater without preparation and proper training. Nor should we engage skeptics without training. Good Bible students, and we must know a thing or two about apologetics in this culture. Rebecca Manley Pipert, in her book, Stay Salt, says, if we do not understand what we believe, we will not be persuasive in communicating it to others, nor will we want to. So I'm glad that you are here this morning. I know some of you have already begun this apologetics training on your own. And for those of you who this is the first time, may this be only the surface, the beginning of going deeper in studying some of the information that I'm going to present. And all of my sources, my references, are at the back of the handout. And the ones in bold are the ones that you should go to first pertaining to this material. So third on my the item of things to do today is to share with you an objection to a major evangelism tool. This major evangelism tool is inviting people to church. Research shows that next to praying, Christians praying for non-believers, inviting them to church is the most frequently utilized evangelism tool. And that makes sense, because when we bring people to church, they hear about Jesus, which is what we want. But today, people have all sorts of excuses and reasons why not to take up our invitation. And this is more frequent today than in times past. So let me share a real experience with you on this topic. Many of you know that I'm a pastoral counselor. I'm a chaplain, a hospice and palliative care chaplain. I have a patient. Her daughter's name is Jane. I'm calling her Jane for just for these purposes. And I visited her mom, and I still visit her mom often. And her mom is nonverbal at this point in the hospice process. And so when I go, I encounter Jane and I talk with her a lot. We developed a good relationship, and it is a recent encounter. Since it was close to Christmas 2023, I decided to invite Jane to church. Jane identifies as a former Lutheran Christian. So I decided to invite her to church. And she said to me, "Chaplain, thank you so much for the invitation, but I no longer believe that I need to go to church." And so I asked her the question, tell me more about that. How did you come to that conclusion? And Jane said to me, she hesitated for a bit and then said, I was reading an article online that said Jesus is not a real person. He's just a myth, a fabrication of the early church. I view this as an implicit rejection, in part, an implicit rejection of the historical reliability of the Bible. Jane, as a former Christian, knows that Jesus is all through the pages of the Bible. He's in the historically in the New Testament and prophetically in the Old Testament. But here she is entertaining the idea that Jesus is not a real person.
Based on one stranger's comment.
Well, it was a lengthy
One line.
article that she went into. And to her, it made sense. But I was thinking to myself, where are the Christians, you know? Where are we pushing back against this? So Jane is just alone with her article, and it's clearly having an effect on her. So understanding that she knows that Jesus is documented in the Bible and she's still believing the stuff that she read online, I refrained from using the Bible initially because it's going to be sorted down initially. And so I continued the discussion on Jane's terms, as if the Bible does not exist. And then I said to her, emphatically but respectfully, I have good reason to believe that the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, lived in the 1st century. And she took note of that. And I said it as confidently as I could muster. And then I said to her, non-Christian ancient sources wrote about Jesus. May I share this information with you? She said, sure. We are continuing the discussions because I'm still the chaplain to her mother and to her family, and we have good discussions. And I pray that it bears much fruit. So fourth on my item of things to do this morning is to respond to the Jesus myth theory. We believe that this theory is debunked and it has no basis in reality, but it's online. And our grandchildren and our children are going to come home talking about this. And we have to be prepared to say, not so fast, not so fast. I will do that by looking at the extra biblical sources or evidence for the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus. So this sensationalistic claim that Jesus never existed is called the Jesus myth theory. And let me take a minute to just orient your minds to the historical method of investigating what happened in the past. Because there are people, you're going to say ancient sources wrote about Jesus, and they'll say, well, how do you know those ancient sources are reliable? And they'll keep going with the questions. And you have to be prepared to say, well, these historians, they did their homework. And while I studied apologetics, I took a course in something called historiography. And it's the study of the methods of historians. And I learned how historians, particularly some of those who worked with discovering some of the ancient sources for Jesus's, the historicity of Jesus, how they meticulously and how they did critical examination of their sources. There are no slouches on their investigation. Like detectives, they put pieces of the evidence together as if preparing for a trial. In that process, they utilize a principle called the criteria of authenticity. And in that principle, there are two sub-principles: the multiple attestation and enemy attestation. When historians find these, they love them. The former, multiple attestation, refers to the quantity or the amount of evidence, multiple reports about something or someone, preferably from different sources. Because if multiple independent sources say that a thing happened in the past, historians believe that it is more likely that the thing happened. Enemy attestation refers to any source that does not have sympathy or for a certain person, a message, or cause, but still affirms something about that person or thing. In other words, when historians discover sources that are antagonistic towards who or what they are investigating, yet they substantiate the given data, they believe that it is more likely than not authentic. So historians love multiple attestations and enemy attestations. I'm here to report that both of these principles are in no short supply when investigating the historicity of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to begin, and everything that I am about to share is the scholarly work of Gary Habermas. Who've heard of Gary Habermas? And a fellow by the name of Robert E. Van Voorst. It's at the back of your handout, their work. Both are American scholars and Christian apologists. Habermas, in his work, enumerates 45 ancient sources and 129 facts about the person, life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and other information about his disciples. And Van Voorst, in his work, he gives more context. Habermas stays on the surface with going in the background about these sources, but this is where Van Voorst picks it up and gives us more details about these ancient sources. So what did who are they and what did they say? The first on my list, I'm going to share only 3 in the interest of time, but you can go deeper on your private time. The first on my list is Flavius Josephus, 37 AD to 101 AD. I want you to pay close attention to when he was born, 37 AD. Most scholars date Jesus' crucifixion at around 33 to 35 AD. They can't really agree on the exact year, but between 33 and 35. Josephus is born 37. So he was born right into the apostolic age and lived all the way through, because the apostolic age went to 100 AD and he died in 101 AD. So a lot of what he wrote is about what he heard and some of what he saw in events that took place. And he wrote in his Jewish antiquities because he was a prolific Jewish historian. I have two quotes from Josephus. The first is, and I quote, Annas, the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. When he had accused them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So he is talking about the martyrdom of James, the biological brother of Jesus. And just as a side note, the official church historian from the first quarter of the 3rd century into the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea, documents that James, the brother of Jesus, died a martyr's death by stoning at the hands of the Sanhedrin. The second passage that I'll read from Josephus says, around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who accepted his message with pleasure. He won over both many Jews and Greeks. Pilate, when he heard of him being accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who first loved him did not cease doing so. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared. This is Josephus, 1st century Jewish historian, enemy attestation. This is why historians love this stuff. And the last source on my list is Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus' work is very significant, and I encourage you to use his work in your discussions with skeptics about the Jesus myth theory. I say this because Tacitus was a trusted ancient Roman historian. He was also senator to Emperor Vespasian and proconsul of Asia. He was a very important fellow. And he writes, consequently, to get rid of the report he's talking about here is Nero, Emperor Nero in 64 AD. There was a great fire. Nero was responsible for it, but he put the blame on the Christians. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians. Christus, Christ, Latin for Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And the most mischievous superstition, talking about Christian activity, was checked for the moment. But again, it broke out not only in Judea, which was the first source of the evil, but in Rome. Powerful stuff. I'm going to mention one other. He is Lucian of Samosata, 115 to 200 AD. Lucian was a Greek satirist. I like to think of him as our political cartoonist today, where they write about real politicians, not mythical people, real politicians, but they do it in an entertaining way. So here's Lucian in his words. The Christians, you know, worshipped a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal, which explains their contempt of death and self-devotion, which are so common among them. And it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers, and they deny the gods of Greece and worshipped a crucified sage and live after his laws. I think this, just a tiny bit of what I presented here today, and the overwhelming amount of sources that wrote about Jesus close to the time of Jesus' earthly life, the evidence is overwhelming for Jesus' existence. And again, I encourage you on your own time to look at the sources at the back of this handout and follow it and go through all of them, because you just never know when you will need this information to push back against falsehoods. Now this brings me to the fifth and final part of the items on my agenda. Atheists claim that they live by reason, and we Christians live by blind faith. They say that they follow the evidence wherever it leads. But I think this claim is absurd, because the whole Christian enterprise stands or falls on the bodily resurrection of Jesus. God chose to begin Christianity with the resurrection, an event that can be investigated and found to be false. How confident God must be. Gary Habermas in his work says, the Christian faith, as it turns out, is falsifiable. It is the only religion which centers its faith on an empirically verifiable event, the resurrection. Atheists have had about 2,000 years to find something, anything, to disprove the resurrection, with no such success. Now, when I talk about evidence, I'm not talking about Jesus' body was placed in the tomb, and from there we know everything that happened. There were no videotapes back then. So, rather, what I'm talking about is a cause and effect kind of approach, where there are certain things that happened surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. Those are the effect. And then we have to ask ourselves, what caused these things to happen? They must have a cause. Undeniably, there are historical facts surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus, to which both Christian and non-Christian scholars agree. Gary Habermas compiled 12 items. There are more, but because Christian and non-Christian scholars could not agree on them, he tossed them out. So they agreed on these 12, and they're all listed at the back of your handout. And I'm just going to go through a few of them. Habermas calls them the minimal facts approach. The first of these on my list is the death of Jesus by crucifixion. Scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Perhaps no other fact surrounding the life of the historical Jesus is better attested to than his death by crucifixion. They all say yes to this. We are familiar with the gospel documents that record this, but I also mentioned some extra biblical sources too. The three that I mentioned this morning, Josephus, Tacitus, and Lucian, they all talked about Jesus dying by crucifixion. So that is well attested to. Jesus died by crucifixion. Believe it or not, there are those circulating something online that Jesus was crucified, but didn't really die.
Of course they do.
This is called the swoon theory. You Google it online. There are people who peddle this stuff. And again, your children and grandchildren will come to you and you're going to be able to put them to sit down. Go on.
After all the torture that he went through, unless they deny all that, there's no way he could not have died. There's no way he could have just swooned after he'd been beaten and tortured and all the other things that happened.
You've gone to my response.
Sorry.
No problem. The response to the swoon theory. These theorists must not have taken into consideration the lethal method of execution by crucifixion. Gary Habermas pointed out that they underestimated the proficiency of the Roman soldiers. You look up the history of the Roman soldiers. They were good at their job as executioners. Habermas also consulted the Journal of American Medical Association, and they concluded that given what we know historically about the physical brutality of the Roman soldiers during execution by crucifixion, no one survived.
And if they did, their legs got broken.
So I agree with you. The swoon theory is unlikely, that is putting it lightly, and so it must be dismissed. And we're prepared now to say this to our youngsters who will come to us with this stuff. The second minimal fact that I'm going to point out is the empty tomb. What happened to Jesus' body? The evidence shows that Jesus was publicly executed. We agree to that first point, in Jerusalem. And his tomb was discovered empty just a few short days after. And then his disciples were on the street proclaiming resurrection. It seems to me that this proclamation of resurrection so soon after the death of Jesus could have been easily verified as a hoax. They simply needed to go to the tomb and verify that Jesus' decaying body is still there. Gary Habermas points out that the Jewish authorities had plenty of motivation to produce the body and silence these men, putting an end to Christianity permanently. But they didn't. The only opposing theory recorded by the Jewish authority, someone just mentioned it quietly, that the disciples stole the body of Jesus.
And moved it.
Ironically, by saying that the disciples took Jesus' body, they are admitting to minimal fact number 2. The tomb was empty. And this is all this fact wants to prove. The tomb was empty. Now, if true, these followers of Jesus must have pulled off the greatest hoax in human history. Why do I say that? Well, I pointed out earlier that Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. He was buried in Jerusalem. Not a very big place, those of us who have gone to this area. The disciples were on close watch by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities. When were they able to take this body a few days after and empty the tomb and hide it, as Andy is saying? When and how did they do this without being discovered? Another thing that we can use to push back against this disciples stole the body of Christ is women. This conspiracy was first reported by women. And in this first century patriarchal time, women were not taken seriously. We just were not taken seriously. And this is a lousy way to start any kind of conspiracy by saying, oh, the women told us. They'd be laughed out of town, or worse. So, this conspiracy too needs to be dismissed, not taken too seriously. But again, it's online and we need the information. I'll say one thing more about this conspiracy. The accusation that the disciples were deceptive, they pulled off a hoax, it just doesn't fit historically what we know about these early Christians. They were people of high ethical standards throughout history, without a doubt. That's who they were. And so this just doesn't fit who they are. The third on my list of minimal facts is post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. These reported encounters with Jesus after his death are significant, not only because they were eyewitness accounts, but because of when they occurred, and I alluded to that earlier. Historians agree that Christians were proclaiming resurrection soon after Jesus' death. Neil Shenvi, in his scholarly work, makes the point. He says, it's astounding that just 7 weeks after, and you will, if you read his book, you'll see how he calculated 7 weeks, after the death of Jesus, his followers began preaching the resurrection in